Well, hello, I'm Chrissy Seaton and welcome back to my channel. Today is video number 6 in a series on the Patriarchs, and we are continuing on with the story of Abraham. There will be links in the description box below where you can read Torah online, and we will now proceed into Genesis chapter 14, and we're going to look at the verses from 10 to 24. Now, in this video, I will be, as usual, reading the Torah commentary and the verses, and sometimes I read out of Torah Anthology if there's any additional information, but in this case today I won't, because the Torah commentaries are excellent and sufficient to make us understand the verses. So we'll just be dealing with Torah today. So what I will do now, I will just read an introduction to chapter 14. And it just gives you a little bit of background. Then I will read the verses and then go into the Torah commentary. So let's begin. The introduction to chapter 14, it says the War of Kings. Now this chapter reveals a new side of Abraham's nature and his physical courage in battle. Lot happily settled in Sodom and became the victim of a war involving the major kingdoms of that region. Although Abraham was hopelessly outnumbered, he mobilized his disciples and went into battle to rescue Lot. Now, miraculously, he triumphed, and in a further demonstration of his noble character, meaning Abraham's noble character, he refused to accept any of the spoils of the war, even though he was entitled to them by the international law of that day. However, he would not deprive his allies of their rightful share. Thereby, he proved his own integrity in two ways. Now, by refusing, firstly, the personal gain, he showed that he had acted only to save his nephew, but not for himself. And he showed that he would not deprive others of their entitlement in order to prove his righteousness. So he allowed the appropriate people who could acquire the spoils of war, but Abraham himself actually refused and took none of those, which he had a right to, but he didn't. So now that's a brief introduction. Now we're not going to study the wars of the kings. We're going to stay with the theme of Abraham. So we're looking at how that progresses, and we will be going now. I'm going to read verses from verse 10 on to 24. Now, you are able to access a copy of Torah online, as I said, but I'll just read from mine and then we'll do the commentary. So verse 10 in chapter 14 begins, "The valley of Siddim was full of bitumen wells. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into them, while the rest fled to the mountain. They seized all the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and they departed. And they captured Lot and his possessions, Abraham's nephew, and they left, for he was residing in Sodom." As you know, that's the choice that Lot made, to live there. "Then there came the fugitive and told Abraham the Ivri, who dwell in the plains of Mamre and Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, these being Abraham's allies. So this fugitive was actually a part of allies that Abraham had. And when Abraham heard that his kinsman was taken captive, he armed his disciples who had been with him, born in his house, 318, meaning there was 318 people. And he pursued them as far as Dan, and he with his servants deployed against them at night and struck them. He pursued them as far as Hobah, which is to the north of Damascus. He brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possession, as well as the women and the people. Now the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return, meaning went out to meet Abraham, after his return from defeating the kings that were with him, to the valley of Shavah, which is the king's valley. But Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God the Most High. He blessed him, saying, "Blessed is Abraham of God, the Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed is God the Most High, who has delivered your foes into your hand." And he gave him a tenth of everything. Now, who do you think that king was? Well, it tells us that he was the, I'm going to save that little surprise. I'm just going to wait. I'll tell you that when we get to the commentary, because it'll make more sense. Now, continuing on, the king of Sodom said to Abraham, "Give me the people and take the possessions for yourself." Abraham said to the king of Sodom, "I lift up my hand to Hashem, God the Most High, maker of heaven and earth. If so much as a thread of a shoe strap, or if I shall take from anything of yours, so you shall not say, 'It is I who made Abraham rich.'" So you see the theme here. Abraham's not going to put himself in a position where people can make false claims. "Far from me, only what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who accompanied me can have their portion." That's what he was referring to, that he wouldn't deny them their portion. Now, there is the verses. Now we're going to look at this commentary, and I'll continue on with that, and we'll begin the commentary at verses 8, but I'll just read what it says. The commentary on verses 8 to 10 actually says, it says Sodom is defeated. So this was the key battle of the rebellion. With his 4 allies, the king of Sodom took the initiative in attacking Chedorlaomer's invading forces. To give themselves the advantage, the 5 kings chose a battlefield that could be defended by an outnumbered army, with the advantage of familiarity with the terrain. So that's planning and tactics. Had they been brave and able fighters, they would have won, but the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were soft and decadent. Not only were they routed, they fled in such panic that they fell into the very pits that they had relied on to give them the upper hand. Interesting how the worm turns. So let's go on now And the commentary now we're going into is verse 12. Lot's taken captive. Now the Midrash notes that the invaders took Lot captive because of his actual relationship to Abraham. They put him in a cage and boasted, "We have captured Abraham's nephew." As the verse implies, he deserved his fate, for he was residing in Sodom. Don't forget that. Having chosen of his own free will to leave Abraham and associated with the wicked people of Sodom. And we dealt with that in the last video, number 5. So they reckoned that the wealthy Abraham would be ready to pay a very stiff ransom to free his nephew. The Zohar explains that Abraham was the target of the kings because he weaned people away from idolatry and taught them how to serve God. Also, God incited them to this course so that Abraham would defeat them and thereby became so respected that people would be attracted to his teachings. Now, verse 13 goes on, and the commentary says in reference to this fugitive. Now, this is interesting. The Midrash identifies him as the giant Og, king of Bashan, the only fugitive who survived the flood. In the plain meaning, he is called a fugitive because he had just escaped the battle of the Rephaim, which had been conquered by the 4 kings. Now, that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, if you want to look that up. The Midrash notes that Og had a nefarious motive. He hoped to incite Abraham to go to war to rescue Lot, confident that he would be killed in the battle. And Og would then be able to take Sarah as his queen. He had big ideas. God rewards for good and punishes for evil. For this good deed of informing Abraham, Og was rewarded with exceptionally long life. For his wicked motive, however, he ultimately fell into the hands of Abraham's descendants. There we go. Now, going on further with commentary, and we're dealing with commentaries on the verses 14 to 16, and this is in relation to Abraham saving Lot. Now, it says, he armed his disciples. Now, Abraham armed his disciples he had educated in the service of Hashem. So these weren't just soldiers. These were people who had grown up in the company and the ways of Abraham. So they were righteous individuals. And it says, sages fault him. Now, this is interesting. It says that the sages faulted Abraham for using Torah scholars to wage war and maintain this was one of the reasons his descendants were consigned to Egyptian servitude. So that's interesting. The Talmud offers a midrashic interpretation that the 318 warriors whom Abraham mobilized consisted of one person, Abraham's loyal servant Eliezer. He was equivalent to 318 people, as indicated by the numerical value of his name, which equals that number, meaning 318. Now, the commentary continues, who had been born in his house. Now, that means Abraham and Sarah had converted many disciples, but the ones who were most receptive to their teachings were those who had been in their household from birth. Lot, however, had formed his attitudes and character before he came under Abraham's tutelage, and Abraham could only refine him, not transform him. Now, verse 17 says, begins by saying, as far as Dan. Now, at Dan, in the north of Eretz Israel, Abraham's strength ebbed because he foresaw prophetically that his descendants would set up a calf there as an idol. This is one of the many instances in Torah where the future events have been an effect on current events in history. The sense of this phenomena is that the potential for the future is contained in the present. I'm going to read that again because it bears thinking about very closely from all of us as an individual. The sense of this phenomena is that the potential for the future is contained in the present. So what we do or say today can have an effect on the future. If there was idolatry in Abraham's offspring, it indicated an insufficiency in him. Now, verse 15 goes on and says, even at night, Abraham continued the pursuit, splitting up his forces to follow the fugitives, as they scattered in various directions, and he forced them to return home ignominiously. Now, verse 16 about Lot. First, the Torah lists the lesser accomplishments that Abraham was able to retrieve and return all the property that had been looted by the marauders. Then it relates to the greater triumph, the one that was Abraham's goal, the rescue of Lot. Even though one would have expected the defeated kings to avenge themselves against Abraham by killing his nephew. Yeah. Now, the remainder of these verses, the commentary now, we're looking at from verse 18 on to 24, and it says, Abraham shuns the honours. Now, the king of Sodom emerged by a miracle from the pit where he had been trapped. This, too, was a divine proof of Abraham's greatness. Despite his humiliation and the clear demonstration of Abraham's moral and military superiority, the Sodomite ruler puts on airs. As the Midrash relates, he had the gall to tell Abraham, just as you, this is the quote, just as you emerged unscathed from the furnace of Kasdim, so I emerged from the pit. The common people, however, reacted differently. They proclaimed to Abraham, you are our king and God. To which Abraham responded, the world does not lack its king, and the world does not lack its God. Now, continues on. After meeting Abraham in the valley of Shaveh, the king of Sodom escorted him to the city of Salem, which means Jerusalem, where they were met by Melchizedek, whom the sages identify as Shem, the son of Noah. Here we go. He was called Melchizedek because he was the king of the future site of the temple, the home of righteousness. As the most honoured of Noah's children, Shem was made the priest of God in Jerusalem. Now, goes on here now and it talks about the bread and the wine. By bringing Abraham and his battle-weary warriors the customary refreshments, Melchizedek showed that he bore Abraham no ill will for having killed his offspring. For Chedorlaomer was king of Elam, which was founded by Shem's firstborn. Now, a priest of God the Most High. Now, unlike the priests of the other nations who served angels, Melchizedek served only Hashem. The sages derive that Melchizedek did not pass on priesthood to his heirs. It was stripped from him and given to Abraham. Even though Abraham himself was a descendant of Melchizedek, that is Shem, he won the priesthood through personal merit, not through the line of inheritance. Now, it continues on. Verse 20, and blessed is God. How can a human being bless God as if man is capable of giving him something he lacks? A blessing is an acknowledgement that God is the source of all good. When used to bless God, the word for blessing is baraka. And it's meaning that God is like a never-ending spring that provides a constant flow of blessings to his creatures. Thus, when we bless God, we are acknowledging his majesty. Now, it mentions here about the tenth of everything. We're coming back to the spoils of war. A tenth of everything. By giving tithes to Melchizedek, Abraham symbolized that his descendants would give or tithes to the Levites. So it's how should I say, the opposite to the spoils of wars, in a manner of speaking, because you are giving charity or tithing. Now, Abraham now declines the king's offer. Now, this is interesting. Seeing Abraham's magnanimity to Melchizedek, the king of Sodom is emboldened to make an audacious request. Though Abraham, as the victor, was entitled to keep all the spoils of the war, the king asked that all his subjects be returned to him, while Abraham would keep the wealth. To show devotion to God, however, Abraham rejected any personal gain from his victory, human and material alike. He vowed, even the most insignificant spoils of my victories will I not retain. Thus have I vowed to Hashem. I decline all personal gains so that you will not go about boasting that it was you rather than God who made me rich. That he returned the spoils was praiseworthy, but the sages maintain that in returning the people he erred because he thereby prevented them from being taught the way of God. So that's an interesting angle, an interesting comment there. So that actually brings us to the end of this video, video number 6 on the Patriarchs, Abraham. Now, as I said, that there'll be a link in the description box below where you can go and read online the verses, chapter we've been looking at. And as I said, I won't read from Torah Anthology because the actual Torah commentary itself was quite comprehensive in relation to these events. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all my subscribers. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to share my videos. I'm happy for you to do that. And in the meantime, I want you to take care of yourself, and God bless.